Welcome back to the Atlantic Council live at the IMF World Bank meetings in Marrakesh, Morocco. Today, at this moment, we're going to talk about positive economic statecraft and really dig into what that means. It's a launch of a new report, and I want to introduce our fantastic panel. I have next to me Felice Gorordo, Acting Executive Director for the World Bank for the US, Nicole Goldin, Senior Fellow at the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council, Global Head, Inclusive Economic Growth, Apt Associates, and Mrugank Bhusari, Assistant Director at the Atlantic Council. Mrugank, Nicole, Felice, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
I really appreciate you being here, Felice. I know it's your first IMF World Bank annual meeting, so we're going to get into your perspectives and what you...
It's baptism by fire.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it, and what surprised you and what hasn't. But Nicole, I want to start first with the paper. We have it here, everyone can see it online, Transatlantic Coordination on Economic Statecraft, and you and Gonk wrote a chapter in that paper about positive economic statecraft. And the idea is that we talk a lot, especially in the past 18 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, about coercive economic statecraft, sanctions and export controls and all the things we at the Atlantic Council cover and study and have been known well. But there's another dimension, and it really is front and center when we think of the Bretton Woods institutions. We've called it positive economic statecraft. What does it mean?
So what it means is, and thanks, it's great to be with everybody and really great to be with you, Felice. It means, as we said, it's the inducement side. It's recognizing that negative approaches don't always work, and they can even sometimes backfire. And so what positive economic statecraft does is it takes a look at development assistance, development aid and lending, kinds of things that you're doing through the World Bank. It takes a look at trade and preferential trade aspects and says, how do these different kinds of tools and instruments work to bring about behaviors or policy choices that are beneficial to advancing our economic national security interests? So that's really what it's about, and it's really important that we're talking about this now for a variety of reasons. As you just said, we are responding to polycrises, and we can't do that only through negative terms, and we also can't do that as individual organizations, countries, or institutions. And so one thing hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit more about is how positive economic statecraft as an approach can help bring us together around this agenda. It's also important now because it's a different economic environment, which is something we talk a lot about at the Atlantic Council Geoeconomics program, in terms of new economic actors and rising economic dominance coming from countries outside, the sort of U.S. Western alliances, if you will. And then you've got the need to kind of counter China or other malign actors in the economic space, and how can positive tools help advance those objectives. So it's a really critical time, and I'm grateful we're able to have this conversation about it.
Well, thank you, Nicole. Yeah. Thank you, Gonk, for working on the paper. I always say this is not a new idea. It's just an old idea the U.S. ignored a little bit over decades, because the Bretton Woods institutions, founded in 1944 during war, were institutions of positive economic statecraft and delivered economic growth for many U.S. allies, first World Bank loans to France. So Felice, you're here representing the U.S. at the World Bank. What is the U.S. vision on how they engage the World Bank in these efforts?
So, first of all, thank you, Josh, for having me. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for this invitation, and Nicole and Gonk for the authoring this report, which I think is absolutely incredibly important and timely for the reasons that you just said. And just to reiterate, the Bretton Woods institutions really are the epitome of positive economic statecraft. Exactly. And I think what we're discussing here today at Marrakesh is really taking it to the next level. And it's the evolution agenda, as we call it, of the multilateral development banks, which is recognizing that there are some global challenges that extend well beyond our borders and have cross-border spillover effects as it relates to climate, pandemic, fragile conflict, violent areas, and more. And I think what we are doing with our shareholding, the U.S. government's shareholding in the bank, is trying to align our investments, our lending, and all the tools in our positive economic statecraft toolbox to be able to advance issues that we care about and that also that our allies care about.
And when you speak about that alignment in investing and lending, one thing I think about a lot, and I give the administration credit because I think a lot of progress has been made even in the past 2.5 years on this, is how you align the U.S. institutions that do this work, and I'm thinking of USAID and DFC and others, versus the international financial institutions that do this work, like the World Bank. In my experience, having worked at the fund, sometimes the same projects are happening at both institutions, and you realize far too late that you're duplicating, there's redundancies here.
That's an interesting point, Josh, and Nicole writes about this also in this chapter, that talking about needing a whole of government approach, but I think there's also a need of a whole multilateral approach, right? And I'll tell you this, I'm fresh in this position. This is, I think, technically week 4 for me.
Wow.
So I'm still kind of bushy-tailed.
Welcome to the deep end of the pool.
Thank you. No. Still really optimistic and idealistic as it comes to multilateral forums like this. Yeah. But what I have seen from my perspective and my experience up until now is actually, at least from a USG perspective, a true whole of government approach. And I'll give you one concrete example, and that's the office of the U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank. We have detailed these from Treasury, from State, from USAID, and we work very carefully and very methodically in a very comprehensive way throughout the interagency to ensure that we're looking at every single project, every single investment, every single guarantee or loan that the bank brings to us from a whole of government approach. And then also bringing other tools to bear. You talked about some of them. USAID is obviously has its own envelope and its own budget that it can bring to bear and its own tools. But there's also the International Development Finance Corporation, the old OPIC, now the DFC. There's the Exim Bank. And Nicole actually articulates a great example, and in the paper, where Exim Bank, which ultimately is about boosting and supporting U.S. exports and goods and services with guarantees and other tools, but it was used in a specific national security priority in Lithuania, right? And there's many other examples of that as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you made that point, because sometimes I think we shy away from this idea of, there's a national security priority or foreign policy priority for the United States, and so that can't be an IFI. But that's not been true to the IFIs historically. No. It's not been true in recent history. Yes, there needs to be diplomacy, multilateralism, agreement, but each country comes with their own foreign policy priorities, and the international financial institutions reflect that. Gonk, I want to turn to you because you outlined in the paper the tools, and I think getting into the tools is important. And Felice talked about that, and Nicole, but hearing from you a little more specifics on the various tools that are part of positive economic statecraft.
So in terms of tools, Josh, there's a bunch of tools that are available to the US government, to the EU, to pretty much most governments. And it's in the form of grants, aid, international aid in the form of subsidies, preferential tariffs, but also you have development finance in the form of loans, concessional lending and other forms. But also you have just trade, preferential tariffs, subsidies. So there's a lot of tools that are available, and in our paper we outlined 2 mechanisms through which these tools can be utilized. So we have tactical linkages where you have a clear-cut linkage between, it's almost transactional, that you give me something, I will give you something in return, and it's an economic benefit. And then you have structural linkages where you're not exactly looking for something in return that is very specific, but you're trying to reorient interests in the target country where there's an ongoing stream of benefits and you get something in return over time, where you just have people in power who align with you on most major interest areas.
That's helpful. Yeah, I think the way you broke it down in the paper is useful, and everyone should read there. The different way of thinking about the tools is useful as an organizing mechanism, because then we as researchers and others have to assess the efficacy of the tools, but you need to break it down in some way. Nicole, I want to turn to you about the private sector. We're talking about public institutions, government institutions, but that's not, from your experience, as you know, how the World Bank works, right? They work about crowding in private sector investment. Other MDBs do the same. How does that play into the positive economic statecraft conversation?
It's a great question, and even also love to hear Felice's thoughts on it. We talk about in the paper, and again, this is probably something that could be argued and debated, that the private sector, while a potential contributor to and beneficiary of positive economic statecraft, is not necessarily the direct wielder, right? Because it is statecraft, which means it is about government to government. But to that point, as we've been talking about this week on different, and hearing about this week, the government does have an increasing really important role to play in creating that enabling environment. And so that's where the private sector comes in, not only in response to, but should play an increasing role in being part of that demand, right? And being part of that supply and letting the government know what it needs in order to be able to crowd in, and creating the incentives through policy measures that will then enable and increase the private sector engagement and private capital mobilization.
Yes.
It has been a week.
No.
Hot week and a long week.
Yeah.
But so I want to pick up, I know it's week 4, Felice, but to what Nicole's saying, the IFC, right? This is with the arm of the World Bank that is supposed to do this work.
Right.
I know it's early days.
MIGA.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And how do you see the coordination happening within the World Bank structure?
Great question, Josh. And I would say this is obviously something that speaks near and dear to my heart. My background professionally is both I served in government and I served and I worked in the private sector. I served both in the Bush and Obama White House, and actually had some interactions with the MDBs when I was at Commerce, because not maybe as well known as it should be, we have commercial service officers at all of our MDBs.
It's a very important point. Yeah, people may not realize that.
And at most of our embassies, who are basically commercial diplomats, there to advance U.S. commercial interests, and also help American companies win procurement opportunities in those markets, and as well as at the MDBs. And all the more so when it aligns with our national security and economic development priorities and initiatives. And I think one of the lessons learned from that experience, as well as my last 12 years in the private sector, working very closely with another MDB, the IDB, is the power of being able, of the exponential power of being able to mobilize private capital and the private sector. And that is actually at the core of the evolution agenda here at Marrakesh. And it's a big part of Ajay's, our president, Ajay Banga's agenda. And I think there's been a realization that our multilateral and our own sovereign budgets will only go so far. And without mobilizing and engaging the private sector in an effective way, we cannot meet the needs. And so that's a big focus of ours here and after Marrakesh.
And that message came through clearly in President Banga's, this was his inaugural plenary speech, and I've heard a lot of these speeches, I've been to a lot of the meetings, and that one was crystal clear.
Yeah, and if I could just say one last thing, I think one of the key aspects of this is going to be putting targets to these goals, and better figuring out how we can coordinate across our various different agencies within the USG, as well as the various different groups within the World Bank, to be able to do this at an exponential level.
And the bank and the fund complementing each other.
Oh, absolutely.
More we can say on that. Nicole.
I was just going to come in with a quick example that I thought of on this, in that it's about care. We saw a lot coming in, and obviously the crisis of care exacerbated by by COVID, but also the opportunity in care in terms of increasing women's economic empowerment and promoting inclusive growth. And in response to that, the World Bank set up its care infrastructure facility. USAID has actually invested through that facility, and the IFC has done a lot of research around the evidence base in order to inform and change employer behavior to provide care and to enable care. And so it's just an example of going back to what PES is about, is changing behavior not only in governments and creating the policy environment incentives, but also behaviors among the private sector themselves. So I just thought that was a useful example that kind of ties a lot of these threads together.
That's actually a really good one. We should draw on that more going forward. Gunk, I want to talk to you about the transatlantic dimension of this. This chapter that you wrote was part of a report we launched in Berlin, Transatlantic Economic Statecraft. We've been talking about the U.S. side, but these are the Bretton Woods institutions, co-founded by the U.S. and Europe, along with 44 other nations in 1944. And on the negative economic side, in the past 18 months, there was a lot of coordination between the U.S. and Europe. Sanctions alignment, export control alignment. But I think what you outline in the paper, and what I'd like to hear your views on, is it's actually sometimes harder to get alignment on the positive economic statecraft side.
Yeah, so unlike punitive measures where you need cooperation to actually impose punishments on sanctions or other forms, for positive inducements you don't need coordination. All you need to say is, here, I'll give you something if you do something for me in return. So the US and the Europe and EU have not really optimized multilateral institutions or coordination with each other because it hasn't been necessary. And it also reflects the fact that the US so far has positive economic statecraft instruments have been very dispersed among agencies, among budgeting authorities, among legislative authorizations, procurement mechanisms. So it's been very dispersed. Oftentimes they're actually at odds with each other. And so you see that there hasn't been a very coherent, or as you mentioned, whole of government initiatives have not been the norm, and the track record has been a bit mixed. The EU is a bit more coherent because you have the EU membership as a whole that has initiatives, but you also have individual countries that have their own instruments and their own mechanisms. And a lot of times, especially with individual countries, you see that they are really focused on former colonies because they have deep historical and trade and economic ties with those countries, and there's relationships that they've maintained. But cooperation between the US and the EU has been a bit, there's a lot more potential there. The main mechanisms through which this has happened so far has been the G7, where the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment,
Absolutely.
PGII.
Great example.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that is the main instrument through which it has gone on, but we still haven't, it's unclear yet how well the coordination will happen or what mechanisms will be put together.
And Felice, maybe your response to that, your early experience working with European counterparts on this. I take Gan's point, when we're talking about issues like trade, it's natural that sometimes, European businesses and companies and countries will have individual interests that don't necessarily align completely with an American or US company. So I understand why positive statecraft can be harder to align with, but what have you seen?
Well, I can tell you what I've seen, at least from my perspective as of now. I can't speak about the previous administration. I can speak about my experience under the President Bush and President Obama, but that might be going too far back. I get it, but with when it comes to President Biden, I think if you look at how he has so methodically and intentionally gone rebuilding our transatlantic partnerships and investing in our allies, relationships, I think you can get a better appreciation that we're not always as coordinated as maybe as we need to do, but we're actually pretty coordinated, and I'm pretty impressed. I can talk to you about my experience working with my counterparts on the board, and I mean we're constantly, not just on email, we're constantly WhatsApping, we're constantly getting together and huddling to make sure that we're on the same page, and when we can't, understanding where we're coming from and making sure we're not caught flat-footed by any surprises. And then at the capital to capital level as well. There's this whole process has been eye-opening for me to see how lock and step we have actually been in our multi-pronged approach, and so I tend to be more optimistic. That's just who I am. But so yes, I'm clear-eyed about we have our challenges. There's definitely more that we can do. There's definitely some redundancy and duplicity and some unnecessary competitiveness. But actually, for the net, I think it's positive.
And one thing I think you're getting at, and Gang, you hit on too, is that I've noticed in Europe from a lot of work we've done, there is more strategy around positive economics. So you hear this from the French Minister Boone has said this, and I think the U.S. has a strategy on the coercive side. That's very clear. And they actually have a strategy on the positive side, but it maybe just hasn't been put into this sort of umbrella organizing principle. So something we can all work on maybe going forward.
And if I can just, one of the things I think sometimes it is, I think, a result of just being heads down focused on doing the work that we just don't always do a good job of telling our story. That's right. And sometimes even doing victory laps, And so I think definitely I take the point on how more effectively communicating that.
Yeah, because I think all the things are happening and the tools are there, PGII as you mentioned, but it's important for people to understand why we do that, what the strategy is behind it, and where it fits into the broader development toolkit of the U.S.
I mean, and to that point, and to what Felice was saying, we initially released this paper at the Transatlantic Forum in Berlin just a few weeks ago. And we had this conversation through the lens of Ukraine recovery and reconstruction with colleagues from the EBRD. And to that point, I think thinking about Ukraine and we were saying about having an actual strategy, I think that's what we're seeing come through. Even if it's not yet being called a PES approach for recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine, we're seeing that come together, that coordination, at least collaboration at a minimum, and how important that is. And that's what we're hearing, from colleagues that are working in Ukraine.
Absolutely, and I would say, if I can, just
Please,
on that,
please, yeah.
It's at the management level. The World Bank and the EBRD specifically, or IFC. It's at the capitals level. And also with our counterparts. We work very closely with our counterparts, our U.S. counterparts at EBRD, looking at deals, if we're looking at co-investing. And so I couldn't agree more.
Josh, just building on that, with the US, we have seen some big infrastructure projects in the past, or some big development projects, but what we've missed is an explicit blending of foreign policy goals with international aid and commerce. And in that sense, that explicit blending has made it, as you mentioned, the strategy hasn't always been clear because there have been different agencies, different aims with different programs. And so I think one thing, we've seen this implicitly with Ukraine reconstruction. There's a clear foreign policy goal, there's a clear aid channeling, a clear aid flow going there, but more explicitly putting those together or tying those two might actually really help clarify the vision and coordinate with other partners.
Of course, then the challenge is in a multilateral institution, the more you articulate that clearly, then other countries might feel, well, this is becoming used as a tool. So it's a delicate balance in a global institution like the World Bank or the IMF, and this is why it's challenging. Felice, I want to ask you a question about President Benga's vision and follow through. I've been through several World Bank presidents, and I've heard these speeches, and they're excellent. He's come in with a very clear plan. I see he has buy-in for them, motivation. I think buy-in from the membership, buy-in from most of the staff. But the follow-through, the execution past the inaugural period, where you actually have to get through the bureaucracy and deliver results.
Totally. Well, I have to say, I first got to know Ajay about a year and change ago, when he was leading the Central American Economic Partnership, which could be an example of positive economic statecraft, right? Spearheaded by the Vice President and really focused on addressing kind of our push-pull mass migration concerns in Central America and in the region as a whole. And I was struck by his dynamism, his vision, and his bias for action. This is someone who does not talk the talk or walk the walk. He runs the run. That's the way
we have literally seen that happen. I can confirm that and fact check true.
He literally will put his arm behind you and bring you along with him. It's absolutely amazing. His energy is contagious. And so is his vision, which he's articulated here in a very clear way. And there are times where he's literally the first text message I get in the morning, and the last call I have at night. And he's not just like that with me. He's like that with many of my other board members and other folks. Incredibly accessible, open to feedback. Looking to have a real dialogue on the issues, and then ultimately get stuff done. So I am actually very bullish on his presidency, on his tenure. And look, we've got our next checkpoint. It's in a few months. It'll be the April meetings.
We'll be back together. Hope you come back.
Absolutely, I would love to. I'd love to. But he made very clear that there were things that he did not want to put on the agenda here because he did not have anything to show for it yet, and it was too early. And so he said, let's actually do the work and come back when we have something more concrete. And so I think you'll be very excited to see what comes in, hopefully in April.
No, I appreciate that. We'll continue to do these status check. And I know this is not something that he's looking at years of the future. He has a quick timeline on this. I heard that very clearly from him this morning. Kank, I want to ask you, one of the most difficult questions in the country we haven't named yet is China. Because when we talk about positive economic statecraft, of course, a big piece of that, not only that, is how we handle China's lending. China's lending bilaterally as a creditor, China's lending through its own development initiatives like Belt and Road, and the role the World Bank plays in contrast to that.
Josh, China's lending, and China has already developed a deep web of geopolitical access and influence through lending, as you mentioned, through infrastructure projects. And so the US is playing almost catch-up. With the G7 at large is almost playing catch-up right now because China has already been very present, especially on the African continent, in Asia, in Central Asia, and elsewhere in the Middle East. But Chinese lending is a lot more opaque, and it's a lot more it's not as focused on sustainability or inclusion. That's the one area where the G7 can really make an impact, is that they have differing visions for how to conduct positive economic statecraft. It's a bit more coherent in China than in the G7, at least in my perspective, because they have a clear-cut vision. They have a clear goal. They know what instruments they want to use, and they have a good sense of how they want to go about it. But also we've seen increasingly a bit more frustration and suspicion of how these terms work, because very often they're just entirely opaque. You don't know what might happen or what kinds of lending terms you're on, and so that's one big difference.
That's helpful. And Felice, on that point, because one of the things you hear often when you meet with ministers in other countries is, World Bank lending is more transparent, but World Bank lending takes longer. There's more hoops to jump through. And just that challenge that so many countries faced of needing resources to provide for their citizens, preferring to work through the MDBs and the IFIs if they can, but also needing access to capital quickly.
Yeah, so if you break down the evolution agenda into three buckets, it's the mission vision, it's the reforms on the operating model, and financial capacity. And I'd say I think we've got strong alignment on the mission vision. I think we've articulated that here. And then, and we've also aligned on what needs to get done from an operational perspective for greater speed and agility. Yeah. And then also aligning our staff and management incentives to be able to accomplish that. If I could just say one other thing with regards to China. The Secretary Yellen has said consistently we're in a strategic, the US government is in a strategic competition with China. And there are things where we're direct competitors on, and there are things where we need cooperation, climate change being one of them. And when it comes to multilateral forums like this, we can also rely on our allies to put pressure for greater transparency.
Yes.
And that's I think the value of an institution like this.
Yes, and we've seen that come through in some of the G20 processes that have happened during IMF World Bank meetings before. I think we'll see hopefully a breakthrough this week or next on Zambia debt restructuring. So these fora and everything that happens about them can make progress in those areas, to your point. We're almost out of time. Nicole, I want to ask you the question I've been asking. 3 years from now, we're going to be in Thailand for the next annual meetings that happen outside of DC. Right. So you'll be a veteran by then. But in Thailand, what do you think positive economic statecraft will look like?
I think one of the things that I'm hoping or I'm watching for is positive economic statecraft in the sectoral sense, and whether that's in energy markets, whether that's around food and food security. And the reason I say that is because I think when we think about sectors and taking a PES approach at the sector level, it can help answer a lot of the things that we've just been talking about as far as the possible constraints, whether it's balancing some of that nuance between cooperation, collaboration, meeting the needs of different actors. It can help identify sectors where we can cooperate, right, with China and others, where other sectors that might be sensitive. And it's a way to, I think, engage people around their, very specific needs. And so that's something that I think by 3 years we'll have a better fix on, and I think that's an area and a space where we can see the PES agenda advance. And one other is the subnational level. It's a question we put in the report is, what does this look like? So I think there is a space for PES at the subnational governance level, local governance level.
I agree, and I would love to follow up on that.
That's okay. Yeah. This is a good takeaway for us with this conversation.
We'll see, and then we'll see you in 3 years. Yeah.
Hopefully sooner than that.
So
that brings me to my final question for you, Felice. First, thanks for joining us to know how busy this week is for everyone in the U.S. delegation. Your reflections, first meeting. I'm just wondering what surprised you, what hasn't?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Gang. Thank you to the Atlantic Council. Love this conversation. Want to continue it. So please count on me for that.
We're in.
I leave here utterly inspired. President Obama, we both served under, had the saying, he's fired up and ready to go. I am fired up and ready to go for a myriad of reasons. One, President Biden's leadership at this time, we haven't talked about it, but he's made a request of Congress to unlock another $25 billion
key point.
in lending capacity at the bank. Amongst all the other priorities that he's dealing with, this is still at the top of his list. Secretary Yellen and her leadership, and President Banga and his incredibly charismatic and transformative leadership. But I'm also inspired by the 189 members here and all the other of my colleagues around the table who I think are here for the right reasons. And in the end, and I was talking about this with my colleague, Pete Weisner at Treasury, and we're talking about, in the end, this is about helping unlock human potential and being able to help support them self-actualizing their potential and removing barriers and unlocking those challenges. So incredibly excited, incredibly inspired.
Thank you for ending on that note. I think you've given us energy for our busy afternoon ahead, where we have a series of ministers and governors coming. In just 15 minutes, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis, will be here. And then we have interviews with Commissioner McGuinness and then Finance Minister of India, Sitaraman. So stay with us throughout the day. Atlantic Council live from IMF World Bank Week. Gonk, Nicole, Felice, thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.